All right, let me begin with a quick story of a police officer who had found the perfect hiding place for a radar speed trap. Yet on the weekends, when he thought he'd be getting more revenue, he was hardly catching anyone. And so he asked a colleague to come by in sort of an unmarked car to try and investigate. The colleague found the problem straight away. There was a 10-year-old boy standing 100 metres up the road from the speed trap with a big sign saying "Speed trap ahead." His colleague was standing 100 metres down the road from the speed trap with another big sign that said "Tips" and a big bucket full of change at his feet. Now, I tell the story of these young entrepreneurs because we're looking at the topic of work today. So this is week 2 in our sermon series on Genesis 1 to 11. It's the section of the Bible that scholars call Primaeval history. And what we saw last week in Genesis chapter 1 is that being made in the image of God means that humans, you and I, reflect something of God's glory. We reflect something of God's glory. Now, what does that mean? It means people are supposed to look at us and see awesomeness, see importance, see glory. All right? We're designed to be glorious. We cannot, what we learned last week is we cannot create our own glory, all right? Like a mirror can only reflect the image in front of it, we can only reflect glory of other things, okay? And the way we reflect God's glory, the way we're meant to shine with God's glory, according to Genesis 1, is through how we rule over God's creation, that's Genesis 1:26, and how we relate to people on this planet, Genesis 1:27. Now, what I want to do this week and next week is unpack those two aspects of what it means to be made in the image of God. But we're going to be doing it from Genesis chapter 2. So we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 2 across 2 weeks. And Genesis chapter 2, as Malcolm mentioned earlier, it sort of zooms in on the creation account from Genesis chapter 1 and looks at creation from a slightly different perspective, a slightly different vantage point. And the aspect of creation that we're looking at today is how we as humans are supposed to rule God's planet. We are stewards of God's planet, okay? Now, because we don't own the planet, okay, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, Psalm 24, the way we shine with the glory of God, the way we are to be awesome and important, all right, is by ruling this planet the way God wants us to. We are stewards of God's planet. What does it mean to be a steward? Well, in ancient times, if you owned like a large farm with a whole bunch of workers, you would hire one guy to be the manager of it all, the steward of it all, and he would look after it for you. And this is our job, to look after God's world for him. We saw it in Genesis 2:15. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And as we're going to see today, the way we rule God's planet is not just through gardening. Okay, that's not the only work we do. Any kind of work that keeps God's creation ordered or subdued is how we look after God's world. And I've got 3 points to help us see this today. You've got your sermon outline in front of you there. So we're going to begin by looking at why, contrary to what many people have claimed down through the ages, why we should actually want to work. Okay, why we should want to work. So I've titled this point, Why Work is Good. We'll then get very practical and look at what kind of work we should be involved in. So I've titled that, What Work Should We Do? And we're then going to conclude by saying that, look, if we work in the wrong way, or if we work for the wrong reasons, our work can actually end up diminishing the glory of God in us, okay, rather than help it shine. So I've titled that point, How Work Should Be Done. But our goal for this morning is to see how work should help us shine with the glory of God, as we were designed to do. So if this is something you would like, please stick with me as we look at the why, the what, and the how of work, all right? Why work is good, what work should we do, and how work should be done. And our passage begins, chapter 2, verse 1. But look, a new section you can see there starts in verse 4. Now, the NIV has a little heading there, but whenever you see the words, "this is the account of," in the book of Genesis, that's starting a new section. All right, so I'm going to come back to verses 1 to 3 towards the end. I want to begin in verse 4. It says this: "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created." And like I said, this account comes at creation from a slightly different vantage point. So verses 5 and 6 talk about vegetation, verse 7 talks about mankind, and then verses 8 and 9 bring those two things together. When God puts mankind in the garden full of vegetation that he has made for him. And we get a whole bunch of detail about the Garden of Eden. There's an unusual amount of detail here. He's talking about rivers, talking about different lands. We're talking about gold, aromatic resin, and onyx. Like, why? What's the reason for all this detail? It's to show that this is not a fairy tale. Right? This is a real account. Havilah was a real place before Noah's flood. Right? It had a real river and real deposits of precious metals, medicines, and gemstones. And it's into this very real garden that God places the man. Again, verse 15, "The Lord God took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." Now, I don't know about you, but verse 15 is actually quite shocking. You may not have picked that up. And it's shocking because it tells us that in paradise, people were supposed to work. Now, if you ask the average person today to describe heaven or paradise, 99 out of 100 would say something like lying beside the pool sipping mimosas. Okay? Most people cannot fathom the notion that they're going to be working in heaven. And the reason is that ever since Genesis chapter 3, work has been frustrating. All right? You see, God placed a curse on work in Genesis chapter 3. He frustrated work. So take engineering, for example. This is the field I used to work in. Now, the reason you become an engineer is because you like things more than people. That's why you want to become an engineer. And so we had this saying in engineering: if only we could cut the people out of the equation, engineering would be great. Some would say the same about ministry. What? But look, work can be frustrating at times. It can, and this frustration can lead us to think that work is inherently bad. So, for example, the ancient Babylonian creation account is called Enuma Elish. It said that the gods created mankind to do their work for them. They didn't want to work. Let's make some creatures to do all our slave labor for us, because work is inherently bad. But here's Genesis 2 telling us that work was how Adam and Eve actually enjoyed paradise. And the reason there was work in paradise is because that's what God does. God works. The beginning of the Bible is all about God's work. And what kind of work does God do? He gets his hands dirty in the mud, doesn't he? Now, there's a tendency in capitalist societies to look down on unskilled labour. It's actually the opposite in communism. So in the genocide of the killing fields, it was the skilled workers that were murdered en masse, leaving Cambodia with no skilled workforce for decades. But in Australia, there's a tendency to sometimes look down on unskilled labour. Yet here's God getting his hands dirty in the mud. On top of that, when God the Son came to earth, he was a carpenter, a union guy, right? And so the Bible tells us work is good because God works. And this is part of how we reflect God's image in the world, all right? So according to Genesis 1 and 2, God has put humans on this planet to subdue the earth, okay, keep it under control, get rid of the chaos, and to take care of it. And the extent to which we are effective in doing these two things, all right, ruling the earth and taking care of it, is the extent to which we will shine with the glory of God. So the first thing to learn about work from Genesis 1 and 2 is that work is inherently good. Now, if that's the case, if work is how we shine with the glory of God, the next question to ask is, well, what kind of work should we do? But to unpack this, we need two comments two preliminary comments. that are worth making. So the first is that when the Bible talks about work, please note it is not only referring to paid work. Okay? The fact is, before the Industrial Revolution, most societies were agrarian. And what did that mean? It meant the father went out into the field to work with most of the older kids, while the mother stayed around the house with the younger kids to do her work. Okay? And so when I say work, please do not only hear full-time paid work. It can mean things like volunteering, like church ministry, volunteering for charities, volunteering in sports clubs and other local clubs, and it absolutely includes being a stay-at-home mum. Right? One of the things that third wave feminism had to correct from second wave feminism was this horribly oppressive notion that if you're a stay-at-home mum, you are not contributing to society. Utter rubbish. All right? Raising up the next generation is among the most important jobs on the planet. So, when we're talking about work, it includes all manner of things, okay? Paid vocation, volunteering, domestics, etc. The second preliminary comment to make is that there is some work that is inherently bad. Okay, not all work is inherently good. So Keller defines work as, I'll quote it for you, the gracious expression of creative energy in the service of others. I'll say it again, the gracious expression of creative energy in the service of others. Now, what does this mean? Well, if it's not a gracious expression, if it's not voluntarily done, then it's a form of slavery. And that's not good work, all right? If it's not an expression of creative energy, like if you're just sitting on the couch, then you're not working, are you? And if it's not done in the service of others, if it's rather a form of harm or oppression, then that is not good either. So, anything that harms society is to be considered bad work. All right, so things like drug dealing, prostitution, making and distributing of pornography, internet scams, cigarette companies, they would all be examples of bad work. I would also add to that working for establishments that deal with poker machines. New South Wales is the world's capital of gambling. Thanks to the number of poker machines that are in New South Wales, I believe we outrank even Las Vegas. And these poker machines are fleecing millions of problem or at-risk gamblers, as well as laundering millions for organised crime. So until they get rid of these poker machines, or at least bring in some serious reforms, which looks like it's on the cards, pray hard, I would say that working for New South Wales clubs and pubs would potentially constitute bad work. You are harming society. Now, with those two comments in mind, how do we figure out what kind of work we should be doing? What do we want to be when we grow up? Right, there's 3 easy steps, okay? We look in, we look out, and we look up. So we look in by looking at what gifts and skills we have. What are we good at? What do we enjoy doing? What are we passionate about? Now, this is not rocket science. It's what every career advisor does, okay? I remember vividly as a teenager, I was about 15 or 16, I remember vividly looking at my minister and I said, man, being a minister is good for him, but there is no way in the world I would ever do that. True story. At that time, I liked cars. And so my career advisor said, you should try engineering. And I did. And I enjoyed it until, wouldn't you know it, I developed a passion for that thing I said never to. So looking in is to figure out what are your gifts, what are your skills, what are your passions. To look out means to see where your gifts and skills and passions are needed in society. So remember, work is energy expressed in the service of others. And this is what God did. Before he spoke the universe into existence, God possessed a whole bunch of raw materials. Things like personality, love, community, and glory. Yet as we saw last week, God did not hoard those raw materials for himself. He leveraged them to make an entire universe in order to share, to spread that love, that community, and that glory. And he did so even knowing what it would cost him. English author Dorothy Sayers said that in World War II, people for the very first time found themselves working not because of money or status, but because there were things that just needed doing. Right? That's looking out. So we look in, we look out, then we look up. And by this I mean to try and figure out what it is that God has put you on this earth to do. So like I said in Vision Sunday, if you're a member of this church, God has put you here because there are certain things only you can do. There are certain people only you can help. Right? And it's the same with work. God has put you here because there are certain raw materials on this planet that only you can harness with your particular skills, gifts and passions to serve the community. And here's the thing, the way we serve the community is to emulate God's work. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is gardening and preaching the word are not the only work God does, according to the Bible. All right? According to the Bible, God is a politician. He creates laws and legislation. God is a lawyer and a judge. All right? God is an investment banker as well as a cleaner. God is a designer, an engineer, a builder. He's a doctor, a nurse, a counselor, a teacher, a historian, a musician. The list goes on and on. And so our job is to figure out which of these many forms of work that we need to keep this world in order have we been put on this planet to fulfill. All right, so what work do? We look in, we look out, and we look up. Now that we've seen what we should do and also why we should do it, one more question. How do we do this? All right, how can we ensure that our work is a good and proper reflection of God's work? How can we ensure that we are reflecting God's glory in our work? Well, the first obvious answer is we need to be working. So the reason I spent an entire point outlining why work is good is because if we only focus on how frustrating our work can be, and look, all work is frustrating from time to time, but if that's all we focus on, then if we suddenly get rich, we might conclude, oh, well, I'm going to give up work. I mean, some people decide not to work without striking it rich. Now, the big problem with deciding not to work is you're going against your design. And when you use something for a purpose it wasn't designed for, bad things happen, don't they? So if we just decide to stop working one day, it won't be long before we start to feel a deep disorientation to our very humanity. This is why there's no such thing as retirement in the Bible. Now, there is such a thing as retirement in Australian society. So as a Sydney Anglican minister, I am forced to retire. I think it's age 68. So it's only 20 years to go. But that doesn't mean we stop work altogether. Because, friends, when we stop working, we start to unwind psychologically. I heard a story many years ago of a grandmother who started to lose her cognitive abilities, all right? And so one of her children invited her to come and stay with their family. And when that happened, the lights switched back on. Why? Because she had work to do. She was helping raise that young family with her child and in-laws, right? She was living according to her design. Now, it's the same with young people who refuse to work. We were talking about this in Bible study this week, and there was a couple of people who said they know young people who have chosen not to work, all right? And they are riddled now with various forms of mental illness. Now, these people are not refusing to work because of their depression and anxiety. They're depressed and anxious because they're not working. But their refusal to work means they are drifting away from the image of God. So we should be doing something, paid or not. But strangely enough, we also drift from the image of God by working too much. Right? We drift by not working enough, and we drift by working too much. And the reason working too much diminishes the glory of God in us is because workaholism is a sign that we want our glory to be shining from our work, not from God. Or to put it another way, we've made work the currency of our self-esteem. We think, oh, look, if only I can be seen as competent by my colleagues, if only my boss notices my capabilities, if only I can get that promotion or get ahead in my small business, then I know I'm worth it. Now notice what we do when we idolize our work. Right? We add a work underneath our work. What do I mean by that? I mean work is no longer a means to an end. It's no longer how we put food on our table or contribute to society or help others. Work is now how I show people my worth, my value. All right? And when we get our worth from earthly things like work, it means we don't shine as brightly. We're not as impressive. And the reason we're not as impressive is because work is a horrible slave master. So first of all, it demands that things like family or health or rest all come a distant second to work. Right? How many CEOs have broken families or die of a heart attack before retirement? But second, when we idolize work, it can only ever lead to one of two conclusions. That means work will either go to our head or break our heart. Okay, if we succeed in work, we'll get all puffed up and we'll become insufferably proud, looking down on others who aren't as good as us. Or if we fail in work, it will break our heart and we'll become insufferably miserable. Right? Work is a horrible, horrible slave master that demands way too much of us, and because of those demands, it actually diminishes God's glory in us if we idolize it. So how do we avoid this? How do we shine with God's glory through our work rather than let work diminish our glory? Well, it's pretty simple. It's through the gospel. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, one of his last words were, "It is finished." What does he mean by that? He means there is now nothing else you and I have to do to get to heaven. Jesus' death has paid the penalty for our sin. But here's the thing. You need to remember, the cross is not just God taking our sin and placing it on Jesus. The cross is God taking Jesus' perfect righteousness and placing it on us. And what this means is it's not just unnecessary to try and get our worth and our identity from things like work. It's actually impossible. Jesus has made it impossible for our work to make us shine brighter than we already do as Christians. Now, why is this? It's because you cannot fill a cup that's already full. If you try, you just make a mess, don't you? Right? We will either become insufferably proud, look how good I am at work, or insufferably miserable, my work has failed. Make a mess. Friends, the way to avoid this is to continually contemplate, to daily meditate, to persistently fix our eyes on the fact that those who have put their faith in Jesus, all right, are now completely accepted by the only person in the universe that matters. And friends, when that sinks in, it takes away the work underneath our work. And it replaces it with rest. In Genesis 2, verses 1 to 3, God sets up a deliberate pattern of working 6 days and resting on the seventh. And friends, if we do not have this constant rhythm of work and rest each week, all right, if we are not resting on the seventh, if we're always finding something that we have to do for work on our Sabbath, we've got to do a little bit of work before we get on the office on Monday. What that means is you still have a work underneath your work. Showing you are seeking value, self-esteem, identity from something that can only ever diminish your glory. So, friends, the way to truly shine brightly in this world, and that's what we all want, because we were designed to want that. Right? The way we truly shine brightly in the world is to remember that our identity is not in our work. It's in Christ. Right? And when that sinks in, if we do blow it at work, if we do mess up at work, yeah, it'll hurt, but it won't crush us. Why? Because we know we are perfect in our Father's eyes. Brothers and sisters, I pray that we leave here today not thinking of ourselves as an engineer or a teacher or a student or a social worker or a dentist. Let us leave here today remembering that we are a beloved child of God. Well, that is how we will truly shine.